He's chairman of the Calamander Group, the investment management firm which is based here in Singapore, focused on real assets, and he's manager of Calamander's private equity arm, Calamander Capital. He's the economic spokesman for us, and has been a board member of the chamber for a while until this past year. He now produces these economic briefings for us, and as many of you know, he spends most of his time these days in Sri Lanka. He serves in an advisory capacity to the UK government's interests in Singapore and to the Singapore government's economic restructuring committee. He was formerly a partner with BCG, and he led the, good time ago, the bank's restructuring in Indonesia. Holds a Master's of Philosophy from Pembroke, Oxford, and a Bachelor of Science from Manchester University. Our economic spokesman, Roman Scott.
Good. I guess it's good evening at this stage. Can you hear me? It sounds a little bit funny. Put this down. All right. Is that a lot better? Right. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to be here again. You might wonder why we're doing a tour of all the classic bonds. So I wanted to welcome you to the 50th anniversary of the James Bond version of the annual British Economic Briefing. So I'm making it very British this year. It will be most probably the only nice thing I say about Britain this evening. I'm not a great fan of current economic policy in Britain, but I am wearing my cufflinks, as you can see, my James Bond cufflinks. I will introduce the Queen this year as well, because it was her Jubilee. So we have a bit of the Queen in it, a bit of reference to the Olympics, which I think is the one thing that the British got right this year. And scattered throughout the presentation, for those of you out there who are huge Bond fans like myself, are references to all the classic Bond movies, right? We'll have a quick question every time you see one to say the year of the movie and who the Bond was. My generation, even though everybody says the Connery was the best Bond, we all know he was the best Bond. The women always tell me that it was the best looking Bond, but I'm a Roger Moore guy. I grew up, with the Roger Moore Bonds. So we'll have a mixture of Connery and Roger Moore titles throughout the through the presentation. So without further ado, it's been a strange year, right? A tough year for all of you. I'm going to spend a bit of time today talking about the markets and investment. Okay, my job here is to give you a tour of global macro and global macroeconomics, and of course, markets are meant to be affected by the underlying economic fundamentals. But that might not always be the case. And one of the theses that I've been working on is the extent to which economics is still relevant, or as relevant as it should be, and whether other things have taken over. And for those of you who are financial advisors, for those of you who are investors, particularly in the capital markets and equities, I think that's an important question to table. So we'll go through the macroeconomics. I will tell you about my sort of medium-term growth forecast and where I think world growth is going to go, but we'll spend a bit of time looking at how the equity markets have done and whether there's a parallel. Dr. No was the first Bond movie in 1962, right? And that's what gave me the idea of having this thing. The 50th anniversary just happened to come on the day that the markets all suddenly turned upwards after a particular speech by Mario Draghi, the ECB president. So I thought it's a good one to pick, and the best title you could have for the person who is currently running the world and who we've been living with this year, right? And as we all know, we, as Europeans, we've been run by the Germans before. By the way, I'm the first to say that Germans run things better than anybody else. When they take guns out and start shooting people, that's something else. But I myself, recently hired an Austrian, actually, which is you could say an even better version to run the hotel. Even the British Chamber of Commerce is run by a German. There we go. I rest my case. So we have to spend a bit of time, I'm afraid, talking about the euro crisis as if you haven't heard enough about it. because that's what is determining returns in markets, how well you guys are doing in both equities and bonds, and a lot of what's going on in world economics. By the way, shall I tell you, what do I press? I've always thought she looks a little bit like Rosa Klebb. Okay? You remember Rosa Klebb? All the bond fans should know who she is. Right? So, are they by any chance related? We ask ourselves. And she's going to kill us in the same nice, slow, torturous way. So I thought before I start and look at what Dr. No has led us into this year, I should just remind you, because I always believe all economists, all equity analysts, your financial advisors, the front group, you should all stand by and all of you should test them on what did they say, what were their forecasts, were they correct, were they not, right? And this is where I left you at the end of last year, so I think it was almost exactly the same time, November last year. And my basic thesis was, look, right, I keep banging on because I did spend a lot of time cleaning up financial crises for the Indonesian government, that balance sheet driven bank collapse recessions are different to the normal cyclical collapsing corporate profitability P&L recessions. And it's a 7-year game. It's always a 7-year game if you're lucky. It took Indonesia 10 years, and we were always talking 2015. It'll be long, it'll be slow, it will be painful, it will be largely jobless for a long time, and it will feel, pretty bad before it starts feeling better. The other thing I said was, which I still maintain, the US is the key to the global recovery. Count Europe out, they have all sorts of struggles, and this is before we went through all the politicking of this year. And for me, the critical thing is the US consumer, US housing, US savings, US retail sales. The consumer in the States has to get out of bed. And Asia, I've always said, is not decoupled enough, even China, to stand in place of, Joe Sixpack in his truck going down to Walmart. That has proven to be correct. I think the thing about fiscal support in the US being over and this new battle for austerity in the Republicans versus Democrats is being correct is politically untenable. So naturally the Americans are number 6. It was easy to be right on the fact that over easy money and central banks would have to step in where fiscal policy and fiscal spend by governments obsessed by austerity measures couldn't do the job. It's not that it is as effective, it's a blunt tool, but keeping money very over easy, i.e. very cheap, will be around for a long time. I said it will remain for at least another 12 months. We've just heard from Bernanke, it's going to remain for at least another 2 or 3 years. Okay? So for those of you betting against the Fed and easy money, I would caution against that. The world will not return to old normal. And I finished on the number 8, was saying, look, there are huge opportunities out there because equities were very cheap, and a lot of other risk assets were very cheap, and real assets had opportunities. Okay? But the problem with investors, and I'll talk a bit about that later on, is you were all still too cautious. A lot of you didn't go into the market, you didn't embrace risk assets, you carried on buying bonds, buying treasuries, and some of the correction in the markets you would have missed. So let's see where we are, okay, 1 year on. Now, if you remember, I always do a couple of leading indicators. The OECD leading indicators, which are fabulous, the only things I think of real soft substance, so I always ask you to use them. I'm not going to show you this year because they're not in the show, right? They're dead. It's the dead parrot. They're completely flat on their back, going absolutely nowhere. And my second leading indicator, which is basically a just-in-time indicator, the canary in the coal mine, is Singapore. Singapore is so linked into global trade cycles and what's going on in patterns of global growth at a macro level. And it's got such an anemic consumer domestic economy. Only 3 million, 3.5 million people that count, right? Because I'm not counting the Filipino maids and the Bangladeshis in their boots, because they don't really consume much. So you have too small a consumer side, you have a very trade-orientated open economy, and it's a brilliant leading indicator. Now, I'm afraid to say the canary is dead. There's actually a lot of debate amongst the economists. We're currently saying if Q4, and it may well be Q4, because Q2 was only just inched over 0, and a lot of people said the Singapore government manipulated that just to get it up. Q3 has come in negative, okay? And Q4 we'll see. But technically, this is a recession. The economist definition of recession, 2 quarters consecutively of negative or zero growth, and you're in a recession. Which is why the second half of this year in Singapore hasn't felt great. And if you look at the export number, okay, not very good, okay? And of course, consumer electronics, as you know, is in not good shape, but even the pharmaceutical sector hasn't made out. Services, the best proxy, I don't look at the overall services number, let's just call a spade, financial services is what drives services in Singapore. Look at the banking industry, also flat on its back, industrial production flat on its back, retail sales, negative. We are in recession right now. Now, I'm not going to say that it's going to last very long, we'll pop out, but growth next year here won't be great. We can't be. If the world is flat on its back, we have to be flat on our back. But look at the unemployment rate. You still have a tight labour market because they've shut the door to bringing in more foreigners. Okay? So you tighten the labour market just as growth has gone down. Smart thing to do? Duh. Right? And look at the inflation rate. Okay? So all of you sitting in this room, whether you like it or not, you have basically lost. Because the annual growth, remember we had a good couple of quarters beginning. Annual growth will come in at 2%. Inflation 4%. You've all just lost 2%. Right? Whether you like it or not, you've lost 2%. Now, I have huge sympathy for the Singapore government because a lot of that inflation is being driven by house prices, which is being driven by liquidity, which is being driven by this over-easy monetary policy, which they have to follow because the Americans set it, and they know they can't fight the Fed. And all of you are running around buying condos and all this kind of stuff, and that is pushing inflation up. And as a result, we've got negative real growth in Singapore. So the lead indicator is not good. How are we looking at for the world? Okay, now, I'm afraid I want to force you to do a bit of thinking in this session and look carefully at the data. I've spent a lot of time picking it out carefully. This is the global economy, global growth, by major system, IMF data, pretty rock solid, and as best as I can get to what it's going to be like for the end of the year with IMF forecasts and consensus economics forecasts. Okay? So you can see that the green line, which is the world, is going to end up at 3%. Now, for those of you who aren't economists, 3% is not a good showing for the world. 2% by world standards is a recession. Okay? There's a baseline level of growth I was telling you that you have to meet just to stay above recession. For the developed world, 0 is recession, but for the world, 2%. We should be doing 3.5 and trying to get back to long-run trend growth rate of 4 at this time. And so we're lower than we should be at this stage. And the US is going to just squeak past the 2% it needs, but it's nowhere near its meant to be a long-term trend rate of 3%. Remember, they have a demographic advantage. And look at Euroland, right? And look at Britain. Where Britain goes, Euroland also goes because they started their austerity nonsense a little bit earlier than the current consensus on austerity that's going on in Euroland. So the whole of Eurozone engine is out. But take a look at China. Okay, China is not meant to, we always have to adjust things for China, but 7% is not meant to be a decent growth rate for China with still 500 billion people they've got to take out of poverty. It's meant to be 8% to 9%, and they regularly do 10%. Okay? The new long-term growth rate for China, I believe, is coming down, and India was meant to be joining the China levels and went all the way up to 10% only a couple of years ago. And it's now at the old, what we used to call the Hindu growth rate, right? When you had all the structural constraints and the poor infrastructure and the socialism and the license raj, India used to grow at 5%, right? So what is going on? This is not a good showing, and compared to where we were last year in 2011, a marked slowdown when it should have flatlined and carried on going. We had the Olympics, so that's the only good thing to say about Britain. A nice feel-good factor. Didn't do anything to boost economic output, but we also had the Queen's Jubilee. So I'm afraid Britain just hasn't made it on that chart, as you can see. And for all the feel-good factor of the Olympics and the Queen and all this kind of stuff, we're basically going nowhere in Britain. There's not that much more to say about Britain. I did an extensive analysis on it about a year or so ago when the Osborne-Cameron duo had just got in, saying if this is what they're planning to do in terms of economic policy, and I look through all the numbers on capital spend and fiscal policy and monetary, this is where it's going to go, and it will be a decade of almost zero growth and a lost decade for Britain. So you can have a look at that. I think we can still get it from the British Chamber if you want those slides. Britain remains in the dust and will continue to be in the dust for a few years to come. And all this comes from a policy focus, in my view, an excessive policy focus on extreme fiscal contraction and austerity at a time when natural demand has fallen off a cliff. Right? And public demand, the private sector, has fallen off a cliff because the private sector is deleveraging and recovering their balance sheets after a housing bust and a credit bust. And the only source of growth left, the state, if they simultaneously withdraw their demand, then of course you get deep austerity and recession. Now, if I'm any use to you at all, and if any economist is worthwhile following, for you guys who are all investors and equity holders, this should be being tracked in the equity market. Right? But 2011, where you saw much stronger growth than we're going to post for what will be a really bad year for 2012, everything was negative, right? And you all lost money. And for 2012, you'll all make money, right? And in fact, they're almost polar opposite, okay? I mean, look at that pattern. Does not make sense, okay? So you know, I am irrelevant, okay? I believe that economics is getting less and less relevant, and that's why one of the things I want to talk about today is, you know, the death of economics. And of course, it's not quite the death of economics, but it's, you know, the increasing irrelevance of economics, and why investors such as you need to start going back to investing the old way, where economics was just part of the story. Okay? So, in terms of what I want to quickly go through, yes, I'm going to talk about macro, but I want to start by talking about what the hell's going on, what's the problem with economics, and why is this less of a predictor, and how markets are behaving. I also want to talk about the problem with money. There's another major issue. I think most of you in this room, all the investors and investment advisors, you're underestimating what is going on in a monetary policy we have never seen, of the lines we've never seen before in the history of economics and modern capitalist thinking. And those of you who know my taste for long-run historic data, I'm going to take you back to 1694 today, right? And so well, I mean it, right? I don't know what the Chinese were doing in prehistory, okay? But monetary policy now, you really have to understand and make sure that you have aligned your investment, your strategies, and you know, worked out what you think on that. Then we'll run through the numbers, and then I'll talk a little bit about investors and the old new things and the new things. Now, I want to just start with this, the first issue here, which is, you know, what's going on with economics and investment. Okay? Now, I posted up 3 very prominent things, all of which had deep influence on me personally. One of which I think is a load of rubbish, the black swan. Right? I think Nicholas Tilley was a very smart man, but I think his fundamental premise is wrong. By the way, I can destroy his entire argument with 1 second, just for fun, which is to remind him that there is no such thing as a black and a white swan. At birth, all swans are grey. They are black and white. Okay? The yin and yang is always there. It has never been it's white, and then suddenly there's this totally unpredictable tail risk at a VAR level of 0.0005%, and it's black and it throws you off, right? Which of course is basically geopolitical risk. The problem is much of the thinking in investors and all the models that you are all using for the last 2-3 decades of extended peace and security in the world, right up until 9/11 and the turn of the century, was all designed and all based on a concept that came out of, you know, guys like Fukuyama writing The End of History, and then people like Friedman going on about the universal values of Western democracy. The Cold War was won, and everyone would be a liberal, democratic, peaceful, capitalist nation with consumers going to shopping centres, and his Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. If you remember, which I hope you've all read it, no 2 countries have ever fought a battle who have McDonald's in their capitals, right? Because you're all busy being middle class and buying flat screen TVs and getting cars and eating McDonald's, and you all peacefully enjoy, a Western capitalist liberal democratic system. Now, of course, that was all bullshit, right? Geopolitics, political risk, the world as we know it, human beings, the idea that history and dramatic events and tail risk could end was nonsense. And all those investment bankers building all those models and putting tail risk into a long end of the model bar and ignoring it, and then you're getting a huge shock when the markets collapse and there's a so-called great financial crisis and calling it a black swan and totally unpredictable and a once-in-a-thousand-year event. That was all rubbish. Right? None of that stuff went away. We know that. Right? Tail risk never went away. We just had such an extended period of extraordinary economic growth, peace and calm from the end of the Cold War until arguably 9/11, right? That we all got complacent and used to this idea, and that you could model everything and everything became AAA. Okay? I believe that the era of just relying on value at risk models, nice things from your financial analyst and equity strategy and economics is over. And we are back to investing the way it used to be for much of history, up to the war eras and after, where you actually have to take into account that risk investments are risky, and we live in a risky world, and there are huge geopolitical events, and politics can influence the markets just as much as economics. And the black swan thing is not some remote thing sitting out there, but it can hit you at any point in time, and it might not be predictable. Now, here is my backing for that. Okay, so I'm sorry, I said I have to get you to do a bit of thinking today and switch your brains on, and then we'll have a bit of fun at the end, right? So I've put up there 3 stock indexes, okay? Your investment advisors will most probably have had you in at least one of them. If you were following me and believed my America is where it's at, that's the place to be for a recovery, follow the American consumer, you would have been in the blue line at the top, S&P 500, our very own STI in Singapore, and it shows you the close linkage between that and the US, how much we're a call option on global trade and what goes on in the US, and Euroland at the bottom. Now, the fundamental macroeconomics, I just summarized in one little box on each of them, were completely different. Right? In the US, you had demand recovery, and the consumer starting to go again. And the savings rate had been built up nicely, quite a bit of deleveraging had gone on, fiscal neutrality, okay? Yes, the Republicans were stopping any more fiscal expansion, but they weren't going into austerity, okay? And very, money was free and reasonable credit, okay? And you could, if you wanted to, refinance your mortgage, unlike trying to do that with RBS back in the UK, where credit was so tight because the banks are still shrinking. Okay? STI, right, and in Singapore, hey, we're still in the middle of Asia, and we're meant to be having the whole Asia boom going on. You can leverage up. Money is absolutely free. People like us have been refinancing like Topsy with SIBOR at 0.35, and we get 120 basis points on it. It's fantastic. It's Christmas time every day. And so credit is easy, a lot easier than it was a couple of years ago, and demand strength, relatively. Okay? The Asian story. And of course, in Europe, you know what's happening. Demand collapse, tight credit, austerity budget, fiscal austerity. These things should have been going in different directions, but they all are tracking each other exactly. It's nothing to do with the economics. Okay? It's something else. Okay? Right, view to a kill. Yeah? Great. This guy knows. Bond girl?
Tanya Roberts. Grace Jones.
Fair, Jones, yeah. This is what was going on. Okay? We have not only been hostage to Dr. No all year, but we have been hostage to Mr. and Mrs. Schmidt, right, in the suburban streets of Germany. Okay? And that has been driving, i.e. political considerations have been driving things. We've also been hostage to what's going on in a tiny, economically irrelevant country, which I keep telling you all is only 0.3, it's not, last year was 0.32% of the economy. I think this year's most probably gone down to 0.25% of the economy. Okay? Now, this is very sad picture, but I thought very powerful. I had to put it up. There were two events, right, that had more impact on your stock portfolios and how you did this year than any economic analysis from any economist or any equities analysis from any top-ranked equity analysis, and it was this event. Okay? When that guy set fire to himself and another guy shot himself, right, within a few days, the retired pharmacist and somebody else, right, the markets, it was a tipping point for the markets, and they went down by 10% in the next month. Okay? It was one of the key tipping points of the year. They were doing quite well. This also, right, this man, Mario Draghi, the ECB president, right, he made one speech in London on the 26th of July, and it had a bigger impact, again, on your stock portfolio and the indexes than any bit of analysis you could have read, right? And he only said 8 words. We will do whatever it takes, right, to defend the euro. That's it. Okay? And if you had done nothing but go short when that guy burned himself to death, and go long when you heard those words, you would have beaten everybody in this room. Okay? That has nothing to do with economics. Okay? So what I put up here, that's the euro index. Okay? And that's how you were doing at the beginning of the year. You all had a horrible summer and went off sick, and your poor financial advisors were tearing their hair out. And then from 26th of September, when Draghi uttered those words, you've all been back in the money again, and you'll all end up, you know, just about positive, right, if you were in US market or Singapore. So you can see that every single major market move, either up, the fiscal compact, positive up, LTRO, dishing money out to the banks, up, right, the Greeks passing their austerity bill, up, right, the Greek default pushed the market up because it said, okay, they've settled it, they've got a haircut, we know what's going on, so it's sorted, the sovereign debt. Point 6, the point at which the market slowed down, right? The fundamental economics were not changing. US retail sales were coming out brilliantly. Car sales were going up, right? I was starting to think it's fantastic. And the housing, as I said last year, was tipping up nicely. And Americans were refinancing, and everything was looking good. And look at what happened to the market, because the guy set fire to himself, and the Spanish thing went out of control, and a couple of banks collapsed, and they had to be tipped out, and Spanish and Italian yields went above 7%, which is nuts, right? And of course, the stupid rating agencies who did nothing useful before the crisis now rush in and try and go overboard the other way and immediately downgraded Spain and Italy to throw more kerosene on the fire. And you all had a miserable summer, right? And it stayed pretty horrible right through the Greek elections and the leadership meeting and the announcement of bank union. That's the first sign of some positive news. But it still slid down. Spain was still peaking at 7%, and then Draghi's speech and those 8 words, for the first time, investors got a sense, you know, they're going to actually do something, right? Not just go round and round in circles and things like that. So it's politics. It's geopolitical risk. Forget all that black swan nonsense. It's a whole load of other things, right? Now, this isn't the only geopolitical risk, but this is a key one. So the others that you really need to be looking at. So if you go away next year and do nothing but follow what one German lady says, Angela Merkel, one Italian gentleman says, right, Mario Draghi of the ECB, right, and actually you could boil it down to just those 2, and watch Spain's yield. There's a reason I took Spain, right? Greece is irrelevant. It's not systemically important. Forget Portugal. Forget Ireland, right? I feel sorry for them, but it's irrelevant. You want something that is systemically important and a key part of the European Union and the Euro experiment, and whether it succeeds or fails, and is like a bank that is too big to fail, and that's Spain. Right? So all I do is follow the Spain. This is the 2-year bond. Okay? You follow those 3 things next year, you most probably won't go wrong. Now, before I go on to the other key geopolitical risks you've got to look at, which is the US, which is the Middle East, right, as usual. Okay, so much for black swans. They've always been in trouble. Right? Let's face it, they've always been in trouble. Okay, they're just now worse trouble than they were before. So and the Russians are a bit quieter than they were before. The Russians have always been in trouble, but I won't talk about those today. I'm going to talk about the Chinese. By the way, I've been warning this audience about the Chinese on record in these things since about 2002 or so, when I put up pictures of amphibious tanks designed to invade Taiwan on one of these things. So I'm going to quickly tell you what to look out for that, for your financial planning and for your support of clients. But I just want to finish on the technical stuff as an economist. Okay? I make absolutely no apologies. This is why I'm so rude about British government policy. I am a card-carrying, totally aligned with this manifesto, right, by Krugman and Layard, Lawrence Summers, and even now Christine Lagarde is starting to talk intelligent stuff from the IMF, Keynesian, fiscal expansion, early years, support, anti-austerity economists. No apologies. Right? I have been through this nonsense. Right? I work for the Indonesian government. I was part of IBRA. I went through an IMF program of austerity. I worked with these idiots, right? From the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank was better. Right? And I've seen what happens when you take extreme balance sheet financial crisis, deleveraging for years afterwards, recessions, not normal cyclical recessions, which totally knocks out private sector demand, and you all run away, and you save and you not spend, and you deleverage, and you take down your debt, which is what you should, which takes out a huge chunk of demand. Because remember, in advanced economies, consumers are 70% of demand. It's not like Singapore, and certainly not like China, right? So 70% is out. They're busy repaying debt, and they've got negative equity in the single biggest thing in their balance sheet, their house. Okay? So you've only got the state and corporates. Corporates don't invest when consumers are down. Duh, right? They sock money away, which is why balance sheets and cash in corporates is going nice and fat, because they think, if I invest now, things are going to go down. There isn't demand there. I have to be very, very careful. So they go conservative. They don't step in, and you cannot force corporates to borrow, however easy you make the money. In Indonesia, we could not get banks to lend. When we eventually took the rates down, we couldn't get corporates to borrow. Right? So if you take the state part of that, and fiscal policy, hospitals and schools and blah, 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 and contract that, okay, you are just taking supreme demand compression and making it a hell of a lot worse, okay? Which is current economic orthodoxy in Europe, trumpeted and led by the Germans, and Wolfgang Schäuble, and Merkel plays along because the Mr. and Mrs. Schmidt and the German man in the street, that's what they want to hear, right? Osborne is just done, right? This is a country that gave birth to Keynes, for God's sake. At least the Germans have an excuse because they gave birth to Hayek while they did this. Like all bad things coming out of Germany, it's actually in Austria. Let's face it, okay? So actually the Germans are okay. So the problem with the Germans is they don't keep the Austrians under control. So, so I recommend you read this and read that manifesto. This is the problem. So for any of you betting on a quick recovery and whether you should start going along Europe now and all that stuff, even though getting more positive on sorting out the political risk, you're going to have -1 to -2% growth year on year for the next 5 years. Okay? If you want to go and buy a house in the UK with that environment, which is what you're all doing as Singaporeans, be my guest, right? I'm not. So, here's where I am on the EU. Now, on macroeconomics, you've heard I'm negative. On politics, the good news, and I hope for all of our sakes, I'm right here, the good news is I'm finally starting to feel that the